It began without warning. No prophecy, no broadcast, no whispered rumor in the dark corners of the internet. Just a tremor. A small one at first, like the kind that rattles coffee cups in offices along the coast. People glanced at one another, smiled nervously, and went back to their screens. But then the second tremor came, and the third. And by the time the fourth arrived, the ground itself had begun to scream. In the Rocky Mountains, a peak that had stood for 10 million years split clean down the middle, as though something underneath had grown tired of being buried. In the Pacific, a naval base vanished beneath a wave that no satellite had predicted, no instrument had measured, and no human alive could explain. Power grids across 3 continents flickered, surged, and then died. Hospitals went dark. Air traffic towers fell silent. The world, for one strange and terrible moment, held its breath together. And then the satellites caught something. A single image, blurred at first, then sharpening into impossible clarity. Green. Not running, not raging. Through a landscape that crumbled with every step he took, as though the planet itself were trying to get out of his way. Worldbreaker Hulk had arrived. The footage leaked within minutes. Phones lit up across every nation. Children stopped their cartoons. Drivers pulled over on highways. Bartenders muted the music. And the world, collectively, watched a giant walk through devastation without a single scratch on his skin. In New York, deep inside the polished glass tower of Vought International, the men in suits did what they had always done. They held a meeting. They reviewed projections. They drafted a press release. They told themselves with practiced calm that this was a public relations issue, a narrative problem, something to be massaged, managed, and monetized. They had spun school shootings into hero opportunities. They had buried scandals beneath blockbuster films. They had turned monsters into mascots. They believed, with the unshakable certainty of men who had never truly lost, that this would be no different. Homelander stood before the cameras within the hour. His smile was wide, his cape immaculate, his voice warm in that practiced, fatherly way that had soothed the nation through 100 crises. He told the American people that the situation was contained, that the so-called Green Giant was a misunderstanding, a foreign agent, perhaps a Russian experiment, perhaps something stranger. He promised, with that gleaming Vought confidence, that the Seven would handle it, that the world need not fear. Behind him, the screen showed Hulk walking through a small town in Colorado. A tank fired. The shell struck him squarely in the chest. It did not explode. It simply crumpled, like a soda compressed against a stone wall, and fell to the dirt at his feet. Homelander kept smiling. But inside the Pentagon, inside the corridors of NATO, inside the war rooms of every nation with a flag and a missile, the smiles were gone. Generals stared at monitors as their most advanced weapons turned to scrap. Fighter jets vanished mid-flight, swatted from the sky as casually as a man brushes a fly from his sleeve. Drone strikes detonated against him and left no mark, not a bruise, not a scar, not even a smudge of soot upon that vast green skin. A 4-star general, his voice trembling for the first time in 40 years, asked the question every leader in the room had been afraid to speak aloud. He asked what they were dealing with. And a young analyst, pale and shaking, answered with the only honest word she had left. A catastrophe. Not a man, not a soldier, not a soup. Something older than all of those words. Something that walked the earth not because it wanted to conquer it, but because the earth simply happened to be in its way. And somewhere, in the deep silent corners of Vought Tower, a single executive turned off his monitor, poured himself a glass of bourbon, and understood, perhaps for the first time in his polished and powerful life, that the carefully constructed empire he had built was about to meet something it could not buy, could not bribe, and could not break. Vaught's response was swift, theatrical, and almost touching in its arrogance. Within hours, jets carrying the most elite supes in the company's stable were screaming across the American sky. There was A-Train, fast enough to circle the planet before lunch. There was Black Noir, silent and lethal, the company's whispered nightmare. There was Stormfront, electric and merciless, eager to remind the world why fear had once worn her face. And there were others, dozens of them, lesser names with greater hunger. Each one promised glory if they could bring back even a fragment of the Green Giant's hide. They found him in Kansas, walking through a wheat field that bent away from him as though the very stalks understood what their owners did not. The cameras rolled. The Vought drones hovered. The narrative was already half-written in some executive's tablet, the heroic music already chosen, the merchandise already in production. Then the slaughter began. A-Train moved first, a streak of red and gold built from arrogance and amphetamines, hurling himself at Hulk's knee at a speed no human eye could follow. The impact made a sound like a building collapsing. When the dust cleared, A-Train was nowhere to be seen. His shoes remained smoking faintly in the grass. The rest of him had been scattered across 3 counties. Stormfront screamed lightning from the clouds. Bolts thicker than tree trunks struck Hulk's shoulders, his chest, his face. He did not flinch. He did not even look up. He simply reached into the sky, almost lazily, and caught her mid-flight the way a child catches a moth. What he did next was not shown on the broadcast. The signal cut. Some things even Vought knew could not be sold. Black noir lasted longer. He vanished into shadow, became smoke, became silence, and for 13 full seconds he was the most dangerous thing on that field. Then Hulk stepped, just once, and the shock wave that rippled out from his heel turned a half-mile of farmland into a crater. Black Noir's body was found later in pieces, embedded in the side of a grain silo 2 miles away. The rest of the Supes broke. They turned and ran, and the cameras caught every second of it. Heroes in capes fleeing across cornfields, weeping, screaming for their mothers, for their handlers, for the gods their employer had spent decades pretending to be. The footage was on every screen within an hour. Vought tried to pull it. They could not. There were too many phones, too many witnesses, too many millions of eyes that had finally seen behind the curtain. In Cleveland, an entire city block collapsed when Hulk simply changed direction. He did not strike a building. He did not throw a punch. He turned his shoulders. That was all. And 40 stories of glass and steel folded inward like wet paper. In Chicago, a bridge crumbled because he walked beneath it. In Denver, the windows of every car within a mile shattered when he exhaled. He did not posture. He did not monologue. He did not strike heroic poses for the cameras that buzzed around him like flies around a sleeping lion. There were no catchphrases. There were no smiles. There was only motion and consequence, and a quiet so deep that even the dying seemed afraid to break it. And the world, watching from couches and bus stops and hospital beds, began to understand something that decades of Vought propaganda had carefully concealed. The Seven were not gods. They were never gods. They were costumes worn by frightened, hungry people. And here, finally, walking through a wheat field stained with the blood of the company's brightest stars, was something that no costume could contain. For the first time in living memory, the children of America did not dream of capes that night. They dreamed of a giant, a silent, green, unstoppable giant. And in those dreams, he was not coming to save them. He was simply coming. Homelander watched the footage alone in the penthouse, with the lights turned low and the bourbon untouched on the table beside him. He had watched it 17 times. He had paused on every frame. He had studied the way A-Train disintegrated, the way Stormfront's lightning bent uselessly against that impossible skin, the way Black Noir's silence had finally, after all these years, met something even quieter than itself. And somewhere beneath the careful architecture of his ego, beneath the smiling masks and the rehearsed warmth and the carefully cultivated cruelty, a small voice began to whisper a word he had never truly understood. He silenced it the only way he knew how. He flew. He found Hulk outside St. Louis, near a river that had begun to run gray from all the dust the world was now coughing into the air. The cameras were already there, of course. They were always there. And Homelander, ever the performer, descended slowly, cape rippling, sun behind him, every angle composed for the broadcast he was certain he would survive to enjoy. He spoke first. He always spoke first. He told the Green Giant that this country was his, that these people were his, that this world had a protector, and that protector was not some bloated science accident in torn purple pants. He smiled when he said it. The cameras loved that smile. Hulk did not answer. Hulk did not look at the cameras. Hulk looked at him. And in that look, Homelander felt something crack inside his chest that he had spent his entire life pretending could not break. The heat vision came first. Twin beams, blinding white, hotter than the surface of the sun, focused on a single point between those terrible green eyes. The grass around Hulk's feet caught fire. The dirt turned to glass. And Hulk, slowly, almost curiously, tilted his head to the side, the way a dog tilts its head at a sound it does not understand. The beams continued. The smoke rose. And then Hulk simply blinked, and the heat vision stopped meaning anything at all. Homelander struck him next. A fist driven downward at full strength, the kind of blow that had once shattered a tank in half. It landed against Hulk's jaw with a sound like a cathedral bell. The shockwave flattened 3 city blocks behind them. Windows exploded for half a mile. A riverboat capsized. Birds fell from the sky. Hulk did not move. Homelander struck again, and again, and again. He struck until his knuckles bled, until his cape was torn, until the smile on his face had become something else, something raw and animal and absolutely unfamiliar. He was screaming now. He had not noticed when the screaming had started. And then Hulk struck back, just once, just a single, almost gentle backhand, the way a man brushes away a wasp. Homelander went through a mountain, literally through it. A mountain. The peak collapsed behind him as he tumbled, ragdoll limp, through stone and ice and the bones of ancient things. When he finally stopped, half buried in a crater on the other side, his cape was gone, his uniform was tatters, and the blood running from his nose was the first blood many had ever seen on that perfect, marketable face. He stood up. Of course he stood up. He was Homelander. He always stood up. But something inside him did not. For the first time in his manufactured, applauded, billion-dollar life, he felt a feeling that no focus group had prepared him for. It was not the fear of being unpopular. It was not the fear of being unloved. It was not the small, simmering insecurity that had driven him to every monstrous act of his career. It was survival fear. The oldest fear. The fear of the rabbit in the field who suddenly understands what the shadow above it truly means. And the cameras blessedly, mercifully had caught every second. The footage of Homelander's defeat reached every screen on Earth within 20 minutes. There was no spinning it. There was no burying it. The image of the strongest supe in human history, flying through a mountain like a discarded toy, had been captured from 40 different angles by tourists and journalists and military drones, and uploaded faster than any team of lawyers could chase. By morning, the meme was already older than the news cycle. By evening, it had replaced every other image in the global consciousness. Vought stock opened at $640 a share. It closed at 11. By the following Tuesday, it was worth less than the paper it was printed on. The collapse was not orderly. Collapses rarely are. Markets across the world convulsed as the great fiction of Vought unraveled in real time. Pension funds vanished. Currencies wobbled. 3 small nations defaulted on their debts within a single afternoon. And in the corridors of Washington, where Vought had once whispered policy into the ears of senators, there was suddenly no one left to whisper to. The senators had stopped answering their phones. They had begun, very quietly, to pretend they had never heard the company's name. The other supes scattered. The Deep, weeping openly, fled to a private yacht in the Caribbean and was found 3 days later, drunk and incoherent, trying to negotiate with a school of indifferent fish. A-Train's brother gave a tearful interview blaming Vought for everything, then vanished into a witness protection program that did not officially exist. Lesser heroes, the ones with their own action figures and Saturday morning cartoons, simply removed their costumes, dyed their hair, and tried to remember what their real names had been. The cities emptied. People drove until they ran out of gas, then they walked. Highways became rivers of slow, exhausted refugees, all of them moving away from the green silhouette that the satellites kept tracking day after day as it continued its patient, terrible journey across the wounded continent. And in a basement in Brooklyn, surrounded by maps and whiskey bottles and the smell of old cigarettes, the boys were trying to find a weakness. Butcher had not slept in 3 days. Mother's Milk had not stopped pacing. Huey kept staring at the footage, watching Homelander fall, watching that mountain crumble, and feeling something he had not felt in a very long time. It was not joy. It was not relief. It was something colder, something that whispered to him that the cure might be worse than the disease. They searched everything. Old SHIELD files leaked from a dozen sources. Whispers from a research lab in upstate New York that had once, decades ago, dabbled in something called gamma. A faded photograph of a thin, exhausted man named Banner with sad eyes and a kind, tired smile. They followed every thread. They chased every ghost. And every thread led to the same conclusion. There was no weakness. There was only patience. There was only the hope, slim and trembling, that whatever lived inside the monster might one day remember it had once been a man. And somewhere, walking through the ruins of a town that had once held a high school and a diner and 3 churches, that man was beginning to remember. It came in flashes. A laboratory decades ago. A wife who had loved him. A green light that had never let him go. Bruce Banner, buried beneath mountains of rage, opened his eyes for the first time in what felt like centuries, and looked out through the cracks in Hulk's fury, and saw the world that the Hulk had been walking through. He saw the billboard. He saw the smiling faces of men who had built empires on the suffering of others. He saw the carefully curated heroes who had never saved anyone they could not profit from. He saw children in refugee lines, clutching toys shaped like the very Supes who had failed them. He saw a world that mirrored with terrible precision every dark corner of his own. Power exploited for profit. Human lives treated as collateral. False heroes ruling through fear. He had spent his entire life trying to outrun the monster inside him. And here, on a world that was not his own, he understood, finally, what the monster had always been trying to tell him. The rage was not the sickness. The rage was the immune response. And this world, this beautiful, broken, lied-to world, was very, very sick. Bruce Banner closed his eyes, and the Hulk somewhere deep beneath his bones smiled for the first time. The rage grew stronger. Vought made one final decision. It was not made by Homelander. Homelander was no longer making decisions. Homelander was sitting in a darkened room, staring at his own hands, whispering to a mother he had never had. The decision was made by the men in suits, the ones who had always made the real decisions, the ones who had built the company from the bones of better men and now found themselves staring down the end of everything they had ever stolen. They called it Operation Final Verdict. The name was chosen, like all Vought names, by a committee. It was meant to sound biblical. It was meant to sound certain. It was neither. Every remaining Supe was conscripted. Not asked. Conscripted. Contracts that had been signed in better days now revealed clauses no one had bothered to read. Heroes who had spent years filming commercials and posing for magazines were lifted from their mansions and dropped, weeping and pleading, onto the front lines. The military mobilized in ways it had not since the Second Great War. Carriers steamed into position. Nuclear submarines surfaced. Experimental weapons that had spent decades locked in deep desert bunkers were dragged into the sunlight, dusted off, and pointed at a single green dot on a map. Compound V was poured into everything. Tanks, drones, the water supply of 3 nearby army bases. Soldiers who had enlisted to fight men found themselves growing strange new muscles, weeping uncontrollably, and being shoved into the fight before their own bodies had finished betraying them. There were experimental sonic weapons. There was a laser built into the side of a mountain. There was a satellite, codenamed Sword of Heaven, that had been waiting in orbit for 40 years for an enemy worth its terrible name. They threw all of it at him at once. All of it. The footage that survived that day is incomplete. The cameras that recorded it did not survive. The satellites that watched from orbit were knocked from the sky within the first 90 seconds. What the world saw was a single, shaking, handheld video, recorded by a 13-year-old boy on a hillside 15 miles away, who lived only because his mother had pulled him into a storm cellar in the final seconds. In that video, the horizon turns white, then green, then white again. The mountain in the middle distance does not collapse. It simply ceases to be a mountain. A noise begins, low at first, and then so loud that the boy's microphone cannot register it. Only the silence on either side of it, like the world has been struck deaf by something it was never meant to hear. When the dust settles, 3 minutes later, there is no army left. There are no Supes left. There is no city left. There is only him. Worldbreaker Hulk, standing in a crater that has replaced what used to be a state, his chest rising and falling slowly, steam curling from his shoulders, the last echoes of 1,000 weapons fading from the air around him. He has not been wounded. He has not been slowed. He has, perhaps, finally been seen. Homelander tried to fly at him. One last time. The cameras did not catch it. The boy on the hillside did not catch it. There were only 2 witnesses, and one of them did not survive, and the other has never spoken of it to this day. But the body was found later, miles away, and the autopsy reports were sealed by an order signed by a president who would later resign rather than discuss what those reports contained. The 7 were gone. Every name, every poster, every carefully merchandised face. Some had died in the assault. Some had died fleeing. One, it was rumored, had simply taken off her costume, walked into the ocean, and not come back. The empire of false gods, which had ruled the imagination of a planet for nearly a century, was erased between one breath and the next, and the world watched. Not on Vought channels. Vought channels were dust. The world watched on phones, on tablets, on whatever signals still flickered through the wounded sky. They watched a green titan stand in a crater that had once been a continent's pride. They watched him breathe. They watched him be. It did not feel like a battle. Battles have winners. Battles have losers. Battles have stakes. This felt like none of those things. This felt like a tide coming in. This felt like winter arriving. This felt, to every human soul that watched it unfold, like something older than judgment, something quieter than wrath, something that had been waiting beneath the surface of the world for a very long time, and had simply, finally, decided to stand up. In 1,000 languages and 1,000,000 homes, the same word was whispered. Not hero. Not villain. Not monster. Worldbreaker. And the children who had stopped dreaming of capes began to dream of mountains. Mountains that walk. The silence afterward was the strangest part. For days, the world simply did not know what to do with itself. The news anchors had no scripts. The pundits had no panels. The advertisers had no soups left to sell. There was only the green figure, sitting now, finally sitting, at the edge of the crater that had been a country's largest assembly of false gods, his enormous head bowed, his shoulders rising and falling more slowly than they had in weeks. And inside him, somewhere beneath the smoke and the cooling rage, Bruce Banner opened his eyes. He felt the body around him. He always felt it when the rage thinned. The vast green architecture that the world feared, that the world had spent decades misunderstanding, was, in this moment, simply him, aching in places that should not have been able to ache, alive in a way that he was always surprised to find himself alive after the storms. He looked out across the ruin. He saw the shattered highways. He saw the dust still falling, soft as snow, on the empty roads. He saw a child in the distance holding a torn poster of Homelander in one small hand, watching him with eyes that did not contain fear, only something gentler, something more bewildered, something almost like recognition. And Banner understood, with a clarity that the rage had never permitted him, what had happened. He had broken a city. He had broken many cities. He carried that, the way he had always carried it, like a stone in his chest that grew heavier with every step. But he had also, he saw now, broken something else. Something that the cities had been built to protect. Something that had needed breaking for a very long time. The lie was gone. The lie that men in capes were better than men without them. The lie that power could be packaged, branded, sold in lunchboxes, and trusted. The lie that the suffering of the small was an acceptable price for the comfort of the spectacle. The lie that there were heroes, and the heroes were good, and the good ones were the ones with the best lighting and the loudest catchphrases. All of it burned away in a single terrible afternoon. The child in the distance was not looking at a monster. The child was looking at the first honest thing the world had shown him in his entire short life. Banner sat with that for a long time. The sun set. The stars came out, indifferent and ancient, the same stars that had watched every empire rise and fall since the first ape stood upright and decided it was a god. He felt the Hulk beneath him, quiet now, listening too. The two of them, for once, were not at war. He thought of the boys, somewhere out there in their basement. He thought of the journalists, finally free to write what they had always known. He thought of the senators who would now have to explain themselves without a Vought lobbyist to script their lines. He thought of the children who would grow up in a world without the easy comfort of false saviors, and who would have to learn, painfully, slowly, what real heroism actually looked like. It would be harder, the world he was leaving them. It would also be truer. He did not know if that was a fair trade. He suspected that no one alive was qualified to make that judgment. He only knew that the illusion was over and that something quieter and harder and possibly more honest would have to be built in the space where it had stood. He stood up. The earth groaned beneath him, but only a little. He looked once more at the child with the torn poster, and the child somehow raised one small hand in something that was not quite a wave. Banner did not wave back. He did not trust the gesture, but he nodded, slowly. And then he turned and he began at last to walk away. History remembers it differently in every country. In some they call it the reckoning. In others, the unmasking. In a few, simply the quiet, because of the strange hush that fell across the world in the weeks that followed, when the screens had nothing left to scream about and the people, blinking like sleepers waking from a long and feverish dream, began to look at one another properly for the first time in generations. Vought survived, technically. Empires rarely die all at once. A handful of subsidiaries lingered. A few executives, the smaller ones, the forgettable ones, were paraded before tribunals and given sentences that no sentence could ever truly equal. The brand itself, the name, the gleaming V that had once towered over 100 cities, became something else in the popular tongue. A warning. A word that parents used when they wanted to teach their children what to be careful of. The Seven were never reassembled. There was no appetite for it. The few surviving Supes who tried to launch new teams, new franchises, new carefully marketed comebacks, found that the world had developed an immune system. The applause did not come. The merchandise did not sell. The myth, once broken, could not be glued back together with money. Governments rebuilt cautiously. They wrote new laws about Compound 5, about superhuman registration, about the limits of corporate power. Some of the laws were good, some were not. All of them were written, for the first time in living memory, by hands that were not being guided by a Vought consultant in the next room. And of the Green Titan, the world spoke in whispers. Some called him a monster. They pointed to the cities. They pointed to the dead. They were not wrong. He had broken a great deal, and the breaking had cost lives that no philosophy could return. Their grief was real, and it was holy, and it deserved to be heard. Others called him justice. They pointed to the lies he had ended, to the children who would now grow up free of the false gods, to the truth that had finally been allowed to breathe. They too were not wrong. Most, in time, came to call him neither. They called him simply what he had always been. A consequence. A reminder written in green across the wounded sky that no empire of lies stands forever, and that the price of pretending otherwise is always paid in the end by someone somewhere in full. He was never seen again on this world. Where he went, no satellite ever caught. Some say he found his way home. Some say he is walking still through some other place, some other lie, some other cathedral of false gods that does not yet know it is about to fall. But no one anywhere ever again called a superhero invincible. That word had walked away with him,